Hi there, Frank Winston here for the Pacifica Historical Society and host of our weekly show, Footprints of Pacifica, where we discover and explore the lure and the lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. Today's show features the first time we've ever invited someone from a historical society other than the Pacifica Society, and the reason for that, it's Mitch Postel, who is the president of the San Mateo County Historical Association. Glad to welcome you. And I want to first find out if we can trace back San Francisco and San Mateo County back to 1856. Pacifica has its 50th anniversary, and you have, which no one can pronounce, the sesquicentennial.
Well, you just pronounced it, Frank.
Well, good. That would be a reason to start back as far as 1856. Tell us what it was like in San Mateo County and how it split off from San Francisco.
Sure. Well, yeah, San Mateo County was not one of the original counties of California. San Francisco County included all of what we call San Mateo County today. We went all the way down to San Francisco Creek. And the ways in which our county came about, there was a lot of political intrigue, and it became a county out of that. The peninsula itself, as compared to San Francisco, was a very rural place. There was agriculture here, and there was some logging in the hills.
What's the population at that time?
About 2,500.
2,500 for the whole what we now call the county.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
And there was a political movement in San Francisco to try to reform government there. San Francisco is having a lot of trouble with wasted spending of taxes and so forth.
Well, that was 150 years ago. Okay.
Some things don't change a lot, but they were very worried about reforms, and it seemed like every time they were able to get in and clean out the city government from the rascals, the guys found jobs in county government, and they'd be able to clean out the county government, and then all the rascals come back and find jobs back in the city.
So what's the reform proposal?
Well, the reform was, why don't we consolidate these two and create one?
So you can't have as many bad guys.
Well, at least they could keep their eyes on them and have one city and county of San Francisco. And of course, that's the way it still is today. Mm-hmm. But when they took this idea to Sacramento, they found out these rascals had a lot of friends there.
Because Sacramento, the legislature still carved up the state.
Well, the counties are creatures of the state. Yeah. And in order for something to happen that elaborate, like a consolidation, you have to get permission from Sacramento. And so when they went to Sacramento to get permission, they found out that they could get their Consolidation Act, but they were going to also have to compromise by allowing all of a sudden two counties. And so San Mateo County, the lower portion, then was carved off so the rascals could operate a new county without interference until times got better in San Francisco, because reformers get tired, and then move back up to the city when the time was right.
So, and was the original capital of Redwood City as it is today?
Originally, this group wanted Belmont to be the county seat, and even fixed an election to make sure that that would happen. But
there was something wrong with that election, I believe.
There was a lot of ballot box stuffing. This might have been one of the most blatant fixed elections in Western history.
And so out of that, Redwood City is now in charge. But going back the 150 years, one of the oldest buildings in the county still remained in what is now Pacifica.
Oh, Sanchez Adobe you're referring
Absolutely,
to. Yeah. It goes back to the 1840s. And it is certainly the oldest structure that you can visit in the county, and is probably the second oldest building standing in its original place.
Now, also connecting our location with San Francisco and the discovery of the bay in your book, which I will talk about in a moment, which is about the 150 years in San Mateo County, emphasizes how significant this location was to the whole development of San Francisco historically. Could you share with us some of that?
Well, this Pacific area was the first historical area, so to speak, in that the mission created an outpost down here in the San Pedro Valley, Lindamar today. And this outpost was absolutely essential in making the mission at San Francisco succeed.
But there was no mission in San Mateo County at that time?
No.
Okay, so the mission that Father Sarah created in going up the coast that went beyond San Francisco, but the one in San Francisco actually depended upon produce and other goods from here.
Right. The Mission San Francisco lands extended all the way down into San Mateo County, into San Francisco Creek. As a matter of fact, our original county, San Francisco County's, its borders were the original mission boundaries. And so they used then the lands down the peninsula in order to support the activities at San Francisco.
And the discovery of San Francisco Bay still gets credit for the missionaries that came here, the explorers.
Well, certainly in 1769, the biggest discovery made by the Spanish occurred right here in Pacifica, when from Sweeney Ridge he was able to peer out and spot the San Francisco Bay.
That's the good news. The bad news, he was looking for Monterey Bay.
Yeah, he had passed it up. He was going by maps that had been done more than 100 years before, which made Monterey Bay look like it was an enclosed harbor.
What were some of the other connections in the 1800s of San Francisco and San Mateo County, and even particularly dependent upon the coast side of Pacifica, what later became Pacifica?
Well, there was agriculture here from the 1900s, early 1900s, and even before that was important to San Francisco. The artichoke was a major crop that originated from San Mateo County coast. As a matter of fact, the first planting of artichokes in California occurred in our county simultaneously in the Pacifica and Half Moon Bay areas.
I was surprised from reading the book, because I knew nothing of it, the significance of oysters, which to me is something, you go into a restaurant, you shuck some oysters or you barbecue them or whatever. How significant was that in the development of this area? Well,
in the 19th century, the oyster was the most significant fish food in the world, not just on the West Coast, not just in California or the Bay Area. It was more, the more oysters were consumed by far than any other kind of fish food. They were popular everywhere. And the entire catch for the Pacific slope of the United States came from the oyster beds off San Mateo County. And so that was a major thing, and that was on the bay side. Between Millbrae and East Palo Alto.
Also going back, you mentioned lumber was a big industry here. And then the time of the turn of the century, how was the population in San Francisco? Did they come down here for recreation, or were we really separate and each kept to themselves and so on?
Well, at the turn of the century, San Mateo County was still a very rural place, only about 12,000 people, similar to what the population of Half Moon Bay is today, maybe a little bit more than that. And San Franciscans used the peninsula for recreational purposes. Agriculture was still important to them. But San Mateo County was able to maintain somewhat an independent status from San Francisco even at that early time.
Now, the governance of San Mateo County was by the Board of Supervisors, and then as they created cities, each might have had their mayor or city council and the like.
Right.
But did the cities really relate to each other? Because I know we feel here in Pacifica for many years we were not really part of the county. Geographically, yes, but structurally not. Services, maybe a few. How was it with the Belmonts and San Carlos and Colma and the rest? Were they all sort of independent, or they lean on Redwood City, or what?
Well, I think that really the story is very similar in the other cities. I mean, once development starts, you need further services. You want to have your own police department, you want to have your own fire and other kinds of things. And that was really the situation for Pacifica in 1957, is that they came to a point where the Lindomar area especially was being developed, and they wanted to be able to have the proper services for this new population.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I read of an East Bay community within the last year who wanted to do that very thing, and then they found out what was going to cost them for all these services, and they said, no, we don't want to withdraw from the county. Yeah, they stayed with the county. Noticed in your book reference to something, I knew some of the transportation issues, Ocean Shore Railroad, we'll talk about in a minute, but that there was actually a rail line to Colma to bring funeral services and the like. I don't know if any other city has ever had a funeral railway car, but could you talk about that, please?
Well, I'm not certain that was duplicated in very many places, but as a matter of fact, they had special funeral cars that were built. And the trolley cars in those days were owned by private companies, and they catered especially to that service to bring people down to the cemeteries.
Well, mentioning then the Ocean Shore Railroad, which was trying to bring passengers and the whole history of the development or the proposed development here, which you can share part of that with. But first of all, was San Mateo County really involved in it, or was it primarily San Francisco and the coast side here without regard to the county's role?
Okay, in the Ocean Shore Railroad, there, you know, the major investors of the Ocean Shore Railroad were San Francisco business types.
Mm-hmm.
And their idea, of course, was to not just have a railroad, but to develop the real estate on both sides of the tracks all the way down to Santa Cruz. But their ideas and plans were basically ruined by the earthquake.
And now that, but that went on into litigation for many years, and there's still some concern over the ownership. So that could be a book in itself.
Maybe we better not talk about that.
Okay. This book came about what? And why you as the author of this history?
Well, the reason being is that this was the sesquicentennial for the county. We wanted to be able to do various kinds of things. We created a lot of new exhibits at our museum. We had a lot of programs throughout the year. And the last thing that was accomplished was to create this book. And there hadn't been a San Mateo County history book done in more than 20 years. And I was in the position as president of the Historical Association to have access to the archives, and I have been a part of studying San Mateo County for more than 20 years. So I was in position to do it, and I enjoyed doing it.
Well, it's interesting that in addition to so much text, there are photographs that go back 150 years. I mean, it's the beginning of photographs, which may not have meant anything to the people at that time, mm-hmm. but A, they were kept, and B, somehow you located some. You obviously could find more, hopefully, but how can people get the book? Through the society?
They certainly can. They can certainly contact the Historical Association, and they can do it, by mail. They can come to the museum and purchase it that way. And there's also bookstores where people can get it. Right here in Pacifica, we're selling it at the Adobe if they wanted to pick up a book there.
Now, when the 20s, if you will, after the demise of the railroad, Pacifica still had a population, and people came out here for, as you say, for the recreation. Some of the stories that you may be reminded of the early Pacifica, in addition to the railroad, things that were happening up until we'll jump ahead later to the war, the post-war. But just prior to that, still a sleepy town, Pacifica, the coast side?
Oh, sure. Well, the Ocean Shore Railroad, of course, never really panned out, and much of the development that they hoped for did not occur. And during the Prohibition times, this became sort of a hangout, again, of gangster types that used the special shelters of the coves for running rum, and some of the larger structures, even the Sanchez Adobe itself was used as a speakeasy. So this was sort of, all of San Mateo County was notorious, but the coast side was particularly so.
So you wanted to have fun, this was the place.
Yeah, if you couldn't get away with it in San Francisco, you can come down the county and you could, and that was saying a lot because San Francisco was a pretty wide open place.
How about during the war, the World War? We have to identify which war, but during the 40s, what went on in San Mateo County, the population generally?
This was part of, as in all of California, the big jump in population. And for our county, the development of the airport was crucial during the war years to
Well, there was a Mills Field, which is still the location. But
before the war, it wasn't even the biggest airport in the Bay Area. Oakland was bigger. And
that's where Amelia Earhart took off from. That's right.
Sure, she chose that over San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few dozen people worked down there, and they had a lot of trouble passing bond issues. The Chronicle referred to it as a prize mud hole. It didn't have a good reputation.
And ironically, we must consider it's really not San Francisco.
Well, it's in San Mateo County, right?
Right, it's in San Mateo County, but it's referred to as San Francisco
because they paid for it. So
we also have a property here. You're probably familiar with the Sharp Park Golf Course, which is administered by Park and Rec out of San Francisco. But historically, since it's still located in San Mateo County, we have the location. And people come here as tourists for that particular
Well, San
purpose.
Francisco owns huge portions of San Mateo County. I mean, the watershed
How
area.
about the reservoir? Yeah.
Yeah, that's 20,000 acres right there. That's their biggest piece.
Now, did San Francisco buy these, or did San Francisco have them and say, you can't get them, San Mateo County? Generally, how did those transfer, if at all?
It was purchased, the
It
20,000
went
acres.
just retail-like?
I mean, a lot of that was helped out by the courts that condemned properties for the Spring Valley Water Company. It was a private company, but they prevailed for the public interest. In some cases, buying out farmers and communities for 10 cents on the dollar. Land was purchased by the city.
Now, with regard to the type of industry, I know you made reference to some dairy farming. That was in San Mateo County, but not necessarily where Pacifica was. Is that right?
Yeah, most of the dairy industry that you would think of around the turn of the century was in Daly City area. Millbrae had large dairies. Most of it was on the bay side.
Okay, then after the war, that's when the development started for the San Mateo County big time.
Big time, right. Well, after the earthquake too, a lot of the communities on the other side of the hill witnessed their first large suburban development.
Because people did not feel San Francisco was safe and might as well avoid an earthquake by moving 20 miles away.
Well, that was partly it, and it was convenient because you referred to the streetcar line. The streetcar line had been built just about the turn of the century. And so there it was when the big one hit, and it just was an easy form of transportation to get into the city.
Probably the hero of the earthquake, at least the post-earthquake area, was a San Mateo County gentleman. And you write in the book, you include him in the section on ethnicity, the Italians, the Germans, and the like. But for an Italian, he did something for the whole of California. You want to talk about AP?
Absolutely. AP Giannini, who was actually born in San Jose. People, make the mistake of thinking he was, an immigrant himself. His parents were immigrants, and he married a Half Moon Bay girl. But he decided to settle in San Mateo, 20 El Cerrito. The house still stands. And he was able to beat the earthquake by seeing that the city was on fire, rescuing the assets and the records of the bank and hiding them in work wagons, disguising himself and other workers as farmers, and coming down the Mission Highway, El Camino, like all the other refugees. And then when he got to San Mateo, at his house, he stashed all the assets and records of the bank in his house, hidden away. And then when the fire went out, he was able to go back up to San Francisco and in the ruins of the city, set up a couple of barrels and put up a plank of wood and open for business.
I believe you marked that as 7 days after the great earthquake and fire, he was back in business.
He was back in business.
And
without walls.
Yeah, and also doing something for the public. Most of the banks that had been started were for the corporations and the like. He was the people's bank, if you will.
Yeah, he really saw that banking services were not being offered to the common man enough, especially to the immigrant classes. And meanwhile, these immigrant groups were creating tremendous wealth in California, particularly in agriculture. And so he saw that the banking services could be utilized by the people and also was a great way to make a buck.
We fast forward to today's generation, of the last 20 years, San Mateo County has contributed greatly to the electronics industry and the computer industry. Some of them began, everyone thinks of Silicon Valley, but most of them had their forerunning in San Mateo County.
Right, the electronics industry was during World War II and after World War II. You think about famous firms like Varian and Lenkirk, Ampex, Delmo, Victor. These electronic firms had their roots in World War II and on the peninsula in San Mateo County, and then gave birth then to the later Silicon Valley firms.
How about Hiller Helicopter? Was that also developed here?
Yeah, in East Palo Alto area, and here was Stanley Hiller, who was an aviation genius, who was refining the helicopter to make it a commercial success.
Other people that come to mind as far as putting San Mateo on the map. If you obviously you have the sports heroes of today, the Tom Brady and the Barry Bonds and the like. Some other heroes that you point out in your book that may have been silent heroes but contributed greatly to the development of the economy or a culture.
Okay, I would put Mike Doolin on the top of my list. He's one of the ones that are really overlooked, and he was the guy that took the airport from being this prize mud hole, as the Chronicle had called it, stuck through the Depression with it, and then because of his World War I connections, he was a fighter pilot during World War I. He knew all the Army Air Force generals when it came time for deciding where defense dollars would be spent. And he got his friends to spend millions of dollars at San Francisco Airport and created then San Francisco International Airport as the airport manager during the war years.
It also developed some employment for this county that hadn't existed before. That's fairly major.
Absolutely.
Okay. Are there others that come to mind of the people who changed? We had some distinguished members of Congress came from this area and changed the face of the whole country. You have Pete McCloskey taking over a Democratic county and winning as a Republican, and then standing up to start impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the greatest mavericks that Congress has ever known is Pete McCloskey, and he is quite a character.
Yeah, and he's still around, and as a matter of fact, his grandfather fled from San Francisco to build a home down here.
That's a Pacifica story.
The Castle.
That's
and,
right.
That's still around, and that also did some rum running in the 20s and had other recreational facilities.
Seems like
life.
any structure that was all permanent and big at one time or another was a speakeasy during the 20s.
Other Congress reps, Leo Ryan, who gave his life for this country.
Absolutely. And people know the story. He went down to Guyana, and of course Jackie Spear was with him. Today, I think Tom Lantos and his important position in Congress.
One of the top leaders in the whole Congress.
So I think we have contributed some great leaders.
Okay. And in the cultural field, any that you come to mind from San Mateo County?
Well, we have in rock and roll Chris Christopherson, and if you go back and popular in popular entertainment before then there's Merv Griffin. So
Merv Griffin, we've got to stop because everybody must know him. His estate now, he just passed away last year. His estate is making money every day, and most of the people are helping to do that by watching Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, for which he not only created but wrote the theme music. And so there's money rolling in every time that happens. So we do have the culture and the architecture. At the turn of the century, San Mateo County developed an architecture different than the Victorians, and it was quite prominent too. We have them in Pacifica, the craftsman style.
The California bungalows?
Yes.
Oh, certainly. In places in Pacifica and also in Burlingame and many of the towns of the peninsula, then you do encounter this new suburban kind of a style that was of the streetcar era.
And now let's talk for a moment about your role with the society. What is a guy like you, a director, just so you come from San Mateo, why are you doing these things for the Historical Society of San Mateo County? What does it need? What does it do as a director?
Why do I think it's an important job?
Sure.
Well, I think especially in California, where we are the largest state, the wealthiest state, culturally probably the most important state, that we tend to think that people in the East don't understand our story. But I think the real tragedy is that people in California don't understand their own story. And it is an important thing to realize where you've been if you're going to be trying to get to some place in the future.
Well, I've often heard the comment that people from the East Coast laugh at us 100 years, 150 years. Antiques are supposed to be 200 years old, 300 years. What do we have as far as what's 100 years? What's 50 years? How important is that to maintain and understand?
Well, it's because what's happening in the last 50, 100 years has been so crucial to the development of California and the development of the United States. I mean, the way that our suburbs came about have been blueprints for what the suburbs look like everywhere.
Except for Pacifica. You'll probably note that we have not expanded or exploded as much we did during the post-war area. But as San Mateo is burgeoning with Foster City and new developments and the like, somehow Pacifica, sweet, charming Pacifica, remains true to that, the trails and the ocean and the fishing and stuff, even surfing.
The folks here have done a great job in maintaining a certain kind of culture and an environment that's very pleasing.
And is there anything else besides my hawking the book a little bit that you think is sort of unusual in the history of this county that is fun to talk about?
Unusual about the county? I would say that there are several high points that should never be overlooked. And I think, you know, the discovery of the bay by Gaspar de Portola was crucial. The mission outpost that was right here in the San Pedro Valley, San Francisco couldn't have survived without it. The way that the county came about politically, I think, is a lesson in how not to do things.
And that's still, except for Denver, I think that's still the only city and county combination in the United States.
Well, you know, I can't comment on that, but I think it's very rare and it's unusual, and it sealed San Francisco off from growth after the earthquake, and I think it really did hurt the city eventually.
You see what he did? He even brought in the San Francisco Seals. That's the old baseball team. I caught that word. Well, thank you for being here because we have to wind up now. Mitch Postel, who was from the San Mateo County Association and the Historical Association, showing the book one more time, and people can obtain it through your society. That's good enough to know.
Sure.
And if people want to know more about the Historical Society, just contact us at P.O. Box 752. And remember, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.